All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into Eric Adams. And, you sent over a ton of articles about him, Wikipedia, timelines, some pretty in-depth analyses. So
Right.
clearly we're going beyond just the headlines here.
Oh, yes, for sure. This is going to be a
This is
teacher.
a deep dive.
Yeah.
So let's figure this out. Who is this guy, really?
It's funny. What strikes me is just how much his story is kind of this like study in contrasts, right? Like you said, he went from poverty to power. He advocates for reform, but at the same time, he's pushing these on-crime policies.
Yeah.
And even with this recent legal drama, it has people debating, is he a victim of politics or did he kind of, play the game a little too close to the edge?
Yeah, you're right. It's not like a simple, straightforward story.
Not at all.
Let's start with those early years. I mean, his childhood was really rough. Brownsville, Queens, involved in gangs at 14, even stealing. It's kind of amazing he didn't become another statistic himself.
Yeah, and that's where that whole incident at 14 becomes so pivotal, right? Getting arrested, allegedly beaten by police, and then you have this black officer who intervenes. It's almost like that moment set his entire trajectory for his life.
Yeah.
He could have easily become, hardened against the system, but instead he decides to try and change it from within.
Yeah, and that takes, I don't know, a certain kind of fire in your belly, right? I mean, think about it. Working as a mechanic, doing mailroom jobs, going to college, multiple degrees. He wasn't taking the easy path.
No, no, no. It really speaks to this drive that we see throughout his career. Like when he joins the NYPD in '84, he doesn't just patrol, he co-founds 100 blacks in law enforcement who care.
Right.
He starts speaking out against police brutality. And he even gets investigated for, criticizing Mayor Bloomberg on TV. It's like he's constantly pushing those boundaries.
He's not exactly shy, is he? And, that kind of makes me wonder, is this genuine activism or is there a bit of showmanship going on here? Like those billboards he put up about sagging pants. Was that really trying to address a problem or was that just a way to grab headlines?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's a pattern that kind of runs throughout his whole career, right? Like working within the system but never quite fitting in perfectly.
Right.
You see these controversies pop up, his comments about Herman Badillo's marriage in the '93 election, then working with the Nation of Islam despite facing a lot of criticism for that. And then you have the whole aqueduct racetrack scrutiny when he was a state senator. It definitely doesn't shy away from controversy, that's for sure.
No, he doesn't. And that continues right into his time as mayor. Campaigning on both crime and reform, that's a really tough balance to strike, don't you think?
Sure.
And then you add in that whole thing about taking his first 3 paychecks in Bitcoin. Is he super tech savvy or does he just love a good headline?
I think it's strategic more than anything, right? It gets people talking, which is what he's really good at. But in terms of his actual policies, he's getting it from both sides.
Yeah.
The zero-tolerance approach to people sleeping on the subway, the involuntary hospitalization of people who are mentally ill. Is it compassion, or is he basically criminalizing poverty and mental health?
Those are tough questions. And he's also been very vocal about the migrant crisis, saying New York City could be destroyed by it. But then he turns around and starts working with Trump's border czar. It seems like every move he makes is this calculated risk.
Absolutely. And that brings us to, of course, this whole legal drama. And that's really where things get super interesting. Remember all that stuff about those Turkish businessmen who are giving him all those lavish gifts? Well, that snowballed into a massive federal indictment. Bribery, fraud, illegal campaign donations. I mean, it looked like it was all over for him.
Oh, yeah, it was a wild ride for sure. But then comes this huge twist. The Trump administration actually steps in and orders the charges to be dropped.
What?
Yeah.
And their reasoning. They claim that the case is interfering with Adams's ability to govern and, get this, to help with immigration.
Okay, hold on. So the timing on this is pretty suspicious, right? Like right after he starts working with Trump's border czar, suddenly, poof, the charges disappear. It's kind of hard not to see that as a quid pro quo situation, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people are saying the same thing. So quid pro quo basically means, this for that. Basically, what people are saying is that Adams helps Trump with immigration, and in exchange, the Justice Department drops all those corruption charges against him.
So they're basically accusing Adams of trading favors with the federal government. What did Adams say about all this?
His lawyer, Alex Bureau, completely denies it all, calls the whole quid pro quo thing a total lie.
Right.
But the fact remains that the DOJ stepped in a way that, clearly benefited Adams politically.
Yeah, that's not a good look. And remember, the re-prosecutor, Danielle Sassoon, she quit over this whole thing, didn't she? And then a bunch of other top officials at the DOJ followed her out the door. I mean, that's not just a difference of opinion. That's like a 5-alarm fire.
It really says a lot about how concerned people were about this case. These are seasoned professionals, people with reputations to uphold. and they were willing to walk away from their careers rather than be a part of this.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what those conversations behind closed doors must have been like. I mean, Sassoon basically accused the Justice Department of playing politics with criminal charges, and that sets a really, really dangerous precedent.
Well, her resignation letter was incredibly critical. She argued that dismissing the case would basically reward Adams for cooperating on immigration policy, like he was putting politics above the law, which is a serious, serious accusation. And it really raises those questions about the integrity of the justice system itself.
Yeah, it goes way beyond just whether or not Adams is actually guilty. It becomes about whether or not justice can be bought and sold like some commodity, which is a pretty scary thought.
It is scary, and all of this is happening in a climate where people already distrust institutions. This just feeds into that cynicism and makes people wonder if the system even works for everyone or just for those with power and connections.
That's what I find really disturbing about all this, you know? If this is how it all works, then where does that leave the rest of us? It's like we're watching this game where we don't even know the rules and the refs are all on the take.
Exactly. It completely undermines the whole idea of a level playing field. It creates uncertainty, suspicion, and that's incredibly damaging for democracy.
Okay, so where does the case stand now? Is Adams off the hook completely?
Not quite. The DOJ's motion to dismiss is still pending.
Okay.
The judge on the case, Dale Ho, he has a reputation for being, fair, independent. So it'll be interesting to see what he does. There's a lot of pressure on him to make the right call.
Yeah, I bet. This whole thing is being watched super closely, not just by lawyers and stuff, but by everyday people who care about justice being served.
Oh, absolutely. And there are so many questions still unanswered. Will Judge Ho actually approve this dismissal? Will there be any more investigation into these quid pro quo allegations? What about those resignations at the DOJ? Will anyone be held accountable for what happened there?
Yeah, and even if all the charges are dropped, can Adams really just move on from this? Like, will it hurt his ability to do his job effectively? Will people trust him? Will it affect his chances of getting reelected?
I think those are all fair questions. This scandal has cast a really long shadow over his administration. And even if he's legally in the clear, the political consequences could be really significant. It makes people question his judgment, his ethics, his ability to lead.
Yeah, it's like this stain that's really hard to get out. People will remember this, even if they don't have all the details.
Right.
It's like this reminder that perception can be just as powerful as reality, especially when you're talking about politics.
That's so true. It's this fascinating case study in how fast things can change in the political world. You can be on top 1 minute and then fighting for your life the next.
It reminds us that power is really fragile.
Yeah.
And that even the most ambitious, politically savvy people can be brought down by their own choices.
Absolutely. It highlights how important transparency is and accountability and having strong checks and balances to make sure power isn't abused.
Well, we've definitely covered a lot of ground here, but it feels like this story's far from over.
Oh, yeah.
I'm really curious to see how all this plays out. Wow, it really feels like we just went through this whole, political thriller, you know? From Brownsville to City Hall to federal court, Eric Adams has had one wild ride.
His story really makes you think about power, doesn't it? Like, how do you get it, how do you lose it, and how do you use it? It's complicated, and even when you start with good intentions, you can still end up with outcomes you didn't expect.
What really strikes me is that this whole thing is so much bigger than just one man. You know what I mean?
Oh, for sure.
It raises these huge questions about how our justice system works, the influence of money in politics, the role of the media in all of this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This whole situation forces us to look at the core of our democracy, right?
Yeah.
And ask some really tough questions. Like, is justice really blind? Or does it favor the rich and powerful? Can we really trust our institutions to be fair? Or are they just manipulated by politicians?
And what about Eric Adams himself? I mean, is he really a reformer who wants to make things better? Or is he just an opportunist who's willing to cut corners and, compromise his integrity to get ahead?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's hard to answer. There's evidence for both sides. Like, you see his dedication to public service, his advocacy for marginalized communities, his efforts to reform the NYPD from the inside. But then you have those allegations of corruption, the questionable dealings, the possibility that he was willing to trade favors for political gain.
Yeah, it's almost like you're looking at two sides of the same coin,
Exactly.
He's a really complex figure, and this case has only made him more of a mystery. I just keep wondering what makes him tick, what his real goals are.
We can speculate all day long, but at the end of the day, only Eric Adams knows the answer to that. What's fascinating to me is how this situation has revealed all these cracks in our society, all these deep divisions between people based on their politics, their social status, their economic situation.
Right, this case has become like this Rorschach test for people's beliefs about power, justice, accountability. It shows us all our own biases and assumptions about how the world works.
And we can't forget the role of the media in all of this, right? The way these stories are framed, the narratives that are created, the language that's used. It all influences how the public sees things, and it can really have a big impact on how everything plays out.
Yeah, and let's not forget social media. I mean, information spreads like wildfire on there, and it's so easy for things to get distorted or taken out of context.
Oh, for sure.
It's become so hard to tell what's true and what's not in this digital age.
It's like navigating a minefield out there, which is why it's so important to think critically. Question your assumptions, look for different perspectives, don't fall for simple answers.
We've covered so much in this deep dive, but it feels like we've only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
There's still so much to unpack, so many questions that are still unanswered.
That's what makes it so interesting, right? It reminds us that there's always more to learn, more to explore, more to understand. It's a process, not a destination.
So if we could leave our listeners with one final thought, one last question to think about as they try to make sense of this whole crazy world, what would it be?
That's a good question. I think I'd ask them, what does this case say about the state of our democracy? Is it a sign that we're strong and resilient, or is it a warning that something's really wrong?
Wow, that's powerful. I think that'll really resonate with people and makes us look beyond the headlines and think about the bigger picture,
Yeah.
Think critically about the systems that control our lives and figure out what we can do to make a more just and fair future.
Exactly. And I hope that our deep dive today has gotten people talking, that has encouraged them to think more deeply about these things and have real conversations with each other, even with people who disagree with them.
It's been an amazing, thought-provoking journey. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
The pleasure was all mine. And to all our listeners out there, keep asking those questions, stay curious, and never stop searching for the truth.